with our discussion of the origins of the Cold War with this issue regarding Germany. This is going to be the last recording for the Cold War for this unit on the origins, and we'll be picking up in the next unit with the development of the Cold War, with the Chinese Civil War, the Korean conflict, and then leading into issues with Cuba and Vietnam. So let's take a look at this situation with Germany. Obviously, the status of the country of Germany was a huge concern to all of the Allies after World War II, and among the big three there were a lot of disagreements and division as to what should be done with this country. You could say that the Germans have had quite a bit of status and influence in the world, especially during the first half of the 20th century. Indirectly, they helped lead to two world wars. In between those two world wars, Hitler was allowed to come to power and basically derail peace in Europe. And so Germany, from the time at the beginning of the 20th century, had been a dominating force that, if not treated correctly, could lead to future problems, which is what all of the big three were concerned about. At Yalta, we know that the big three decided to temporarily divide Germany into initially 3 zones, and then a fourth was added for the country of France. And this was seen as obviously temporary, and these occupation zones would be administered by the ACC, or the Allied Control Council. And then Berlin also would be divided temporarily into 4 zones as well, even though the city itself was in the Soviet sector. But because all of this was seen as temporary, no real concern was given at Yalta. The issues about Germany widened and caused more conflict at the other conference after Yalta, Potsdam. And at this point, Truman was now in power, and Stalin had been known up to this point to not really follow through on his agreements at Yalta with the Declaration of Liberated Europe. He, at this point, was already doing some brutal tactics and sneaky things in Eastern Europe, and therefore at Potsdam we were much more suspicious of his intentions. At Potsdam, the main situation that was discussed was the reparations issue and what type of reparations would be appropriate for the country. Obviously there were differences of opinions. The Soviets wanted heavy reparations due to their devastation at the hands of the Germans during World War II. Obviously France would have bitter feelings as well, considering all they've suffered from the Germans in both world wars. The Americans and the British were more reluctant to exact heavy reparations because they felt that that would just cause the same problems that happened after World War I with the Treaty of Versailles. So there were some issues about what kinds of reparations should be taken. It was then decided that the Soviets could take reparations from their own zone of occupation. They wanted more than $20 billion in reparations. And so there was discussions as far as them being able to take reparations from their own zones, along with agreements about exchanging food and industrial materials from the other zones that weren't quite as present in the Soviet zone. So these differences about how to treat Germany divided the big three even more so at the Potsdam Conference than it had at Yalta. The British and Americans had come to realize that their zones contained most of the Germans, and the Soviet zone contained most of the food. They had also decided against dismantling German industry, since destroying Europe's most productive economy would cripple the continent's recovery and make Germany a permanent dependency of the Allies. So now at Potsdam they would only speak of reparations only in terms of exchange of West German industrial goods for East German food. The Soviets obviously objected because they did not want to have continued interference with their ability to rehabilitate their own economy and prevent Germany from becoming any more of a threat. Plus, we know that they wanted to spread communism throughout the continent, and having to work with the Americans and the British with these reparations issues would hinder that. In September of 1945, about a month after the Japanese surrender, the foreign ministers of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council met in London for the first time for what was called the Conference of Foreign Ministers. They would have future conferences in Moscow, Paris, back at London again, and the whole purpose was to facilitate the transition from war to peace. At this particular conference, they were given the task of drafting peace treaties between the Grand Alliance and Germany's wartime allies, which included Bulgaria, Finland, Hungary, Italy, and Romania, which many of them were forced to be Germany's wartime allies. But that was the main purpose of what they were trying to do. At this point, we had successfully used the atomic bomb on Japan, so we kind of felt we had that in our back pocket, and the Soviets would just basically bow down and do whatever we wanted them to do because they had seen it displayed. But they proved to be very tough negotiators and still unwilling to yield to American demands. Our goals were basically that compliance with the Yalta Accords be given out, which included free elections. That was a big issue with that Declaration of a Liberated Europe that was signed at the Yalta Conference, that countries in Eastern Europe, including Poland and Germany eventually, would have free elections. The Soviets' position was that we had no business in interfering in Eastern Europe. They kind of felt it was hypocritical because we had areas that we had interest and more or less occupation in, and the Soviets felt that Eastern Europe, in a way, owed them for liberating them from Nazi Germany. So they kind of felt that it was hypocritical for us to make any type of demands on Eastern Europe when we had areas that we had strong influence in as well. So pretty much the outcome of the treaty is that, or outcome of this conference was that it got bogged down and adjourned without any real agreements. But there were some steps taken in the direction of treaties that were supposed to be drafted. After this conference, in the next few months, we tried to get some more intelligence on the USSR. Burns sent a man by the name of Mark Etheridge to draft a report after being sent to the Balkans on a fact-finding mission. Basically, the report legitimized Soviet concerns in the region, but also emphasized that they were out for expansion and that they were pretty much being imperialistic. At that point, the U.S. Congress simultaneously approved a $3.5 billion loan to Britain, and the Soviets' request for $6 billion in help pretty much got shelved for a while because of this report showing that the Soviets' actions were being aggressive. A couple months later, in December of 1945, this conference of foreign ministers met again in Moscow this time, and this conference went a lot smoother than the London conference up here. And the main reason for that was because there were some issues in the Balkans that were resolved in favor of the Soviets, such as Romania and Bulgaria adding 2 non-communists to their governments, and that to the Soviets meant that they were being in line with quote-unquote free elections. The treaties for Soviet satellites would then be drafted at the forthcoming peace conference in Paris. So the Soviets felt a little bit more secure coming into this conference. Additionally, at the Moscow conference, issues affecting Korea, China, and Japan were settled, and the Soviets agreed to a joint American-British-Canadian proposal to establish a UN commission to control atomic energy. So that was seen as a step of cooperation. However, the Iran issue was still unresolved, and we know from previous recordings that the Soviets kept their troops in Iran, and that caused a lot of tension, which the UN Security Council finally stepped in and showed their success in forcing the Soviets out. But you can see the development of these conferences to try to resolve issues in Europe and down into the Mediterranean with the Balkans, issues relating to nuclear weapons, were all discussed at these conferences. So really they were trying to work for cooperation, even though it was tense at times. Moving on, in March of 1946, just a few months after the Moscow conference, these Conference of Foreign Ministers met again in Paris this time. And at this point, Truman and his Secretary of State Burns decided to put a little test out to Stalin. Their motive basically was to call the Russians bluff. And what they did was they proposed a 4-power treaty that would guarantee the demilitarization of Germany for 25 years. And basically what this would do is it would satisfy removing the greatest threat to the Soviet security, because their big issue was that they didn't want to be invaded again, or have the Germans be anywhere near the potential of causing the problems that they had to the Soviet Union in the 2 world wars. So with Truman and Burns proposing this, the Soviets would look bad if they didn't accept this, because this supposedly was their biggest issue. And really, this would eliminate the justification for any Soviet police force-style tactics that they had been using in Eastern Europe, and it would ensure long-term American military presence in the continent of Europe, because this was supposed to be a 25-year thing here. So let's look at the Soviet reaction to this. At first, Molotov, the Moscow foreign minister, was uncommittal. He preferred to really speak of immediate disarmament and get rid of Germany's military potential and take reparations. So he really didn't even say anything about this proposal. He just kept saying again how he wanted to, prevent Germany from ever being a threat again. So that kind of showed what the Soviets were really wanting, was to destroy Germany and not really for their own security. And so our position was that That couldn't happen. You can't take heavy reparations from Germany and expect the country to recover. And if you want a recovered European economy, Germany had to be a part of that. This showed that the Soviets were interested in expanding rather than their own security, like I've mentioned. And at this point, the Americans and the British began to combine their sectors into one, which they named Bizonia. The French at this point still hadn't been committed to that, but because of their position after World War II, they really didn't have much room to stand up to the British and the Americans. About 6 months after this speech, Burns made a about 6 months after this conference in Paris, Burns made a very famous speech in the German city of Stuttgart. And in this speech, he pretty much assured the German people that the American forces would remain and that reunification might not occur anytime soon, which is what they had been told at the end of World War II, that this was just a temporary thing. But now at this point, it's not looking like that could happen. Because we knew that a reunified Germany could fall under Russian domination, and we did not want that to happen, obviously. Supporting that, we had evidence that Stalin, as early as June of 1945, was planning to incorporate a reunified Germany within Moscow's sphere of influence, and doing that with the Red Army to control the Soviet zone and to try to gain popularity for communism in the Western zones, which never occurred. But you can see that Stalin was strategically planning this all along. So, when our two zones began to combine, and later the French, the Soviets obviously responded pretty negatively to this. There was another conference held in London again in 1947. This was in December of that year, and if you look on page 32 of your book, you can see the conference mentioned, and pretty much it was just a mudslinging session with accusations being thrown at each other rather than any type of progress in making an official German peace treaty, because this whole idea of division of the country was just supposed to be temporary. But these accusations being thrown at each other and their inability to compromise made this conference be a complete failure. They met again in March of 1948 after the December 1947 meeting was obviously unsuccessful. And at the March 1948 meeting, they had even more issues. The Soviets were trying to prevent a Western construction of a separate German state, because you can see on your page on 32, in the paragraph discussing the London Conference, that in the 1948 one, we had met together with our French and British counterparts to try to draw up a constitution for a new West German state, and also to introduce the idea of a new currency into the Western sectors. So the Soviets knew that we were developing our zones into one new country of West Germany, and they decided to try to throw a roadblock in this by obstructing traffic between Berlin and Western Germany. Berlin was divided, like we said at the Yalta Conference, where it was the country was divided into four zones. Berlin also was divided into four zones itself, even though it was within the Soviet zone. You can see a map of this in your book on page 33 where Berlin is, and it really makes no sense to divide that city within the zone of one of the four, but because it was seen as a temporary thing, it wasn't given much consideration at the Yalta Conference. But now it was a huge problem. The people of West Berlin, or the sectors controlled by the Americans, British, and the French, could not get to the western sectors of Germany, and so the Soviets had the ability to stop and obstruct that traffic, would make it impossible to get back and forth. So if you look on the screen here, you can see the issue with Berlin, and the Soviets were hoping that pressuring Berlin might make the Western forces withdraw. He was trying to call our bluff. If the map, again, in your book, it's on page 33. This is from the other book that I've used. And so Stalin figured that since we hadn't used the atomic bomb since Japan, that we probably would not use it in Eastern Europe, so he was trying to test us to see how far we would go with this issue. So finally, you can see a breakdown of events here with this confrontation. Beginning in June of 1948, after we officially agreed to consolidate our zone, the French zone, and the American zone into one, which would become known as West Germany. We created the new currency for West Germany and West Berlin. The Soviets then set up their new currency for East Germany. And then after that, they began to cut off all road and rail access from the people of West Berlin to the outside into West Germany. And so Truman announced in June 29th that we would remain in Berlin. He then sent planes to not attack, but you can see here, to airlift supplies to people of West Berlin. Food, medicine, coal, even candy for children, clothing were dropped from these planes. One day, There was one plane every 3 minutes that was dropping supplies to the people of West Berlin, showing them that we were not abandoning them. It made the Soviets look terrible because they were willing to starve women and children instead of allowing people to have access to get supplies. And so we came out of this with definitely a publicity boost, whereas the Soviets looked humiliated.